My name is Marie Mancuso Cromwell. I'm from the class of 1971, and I'm also the chair of the steering committee of the Dorothy Day Lecture Series. I just want to say, after 2 years of isolation, it is so wonderful to see you. Thank you all for being here today. Before we get underway, I would like to acknowledge that our college president, Sister Janet Eisner, is here in the audience. Welcome, Sister Janet. Sister Janet, you've been at Emmanuel College as long as I and many people have been since we were students. You are Emmanuel College to us. Absolutely, yep. Well, this may be the last Dorothy Day that you attend as president. We are hoping that you will come back and visit us again and not be too far away, right? Very good. Okay. I guess the best thing is that we really want to wish you the very best as you approach the next great adventure of your life and work. And, and we hope you won't forget us here. I do have something to give you as a gift from the committee. And if you'll come up, I'll hand you that and you can say a few words.
Thank you very much, Marie, and I share her sentiments that we're so happy to be able to see each other face to face once again. So thank you for being here. And if there were a more consequential topic for this gathering, I cannot think of one. So we are just delighted that I'm not doing the introduction, so we want to make sure we welcome our speaker as well. But I'm particularly thrilled because you, class of 71, have been the leaders of this Dorothy Day lecture series, as you know, for the last 9 years. Dorothy Day herself spoke here a number of times before our times. And this was a wonderful way to continue the focus. That's one of the value propositions and value realities of an Emmanuel education. For me, I'm happy to see the class of 1971. I believe I admitted some of those students to this college when I was director of admissions. And I also know that I was here with them through a very important time, not only in the history of the country, but in the history of Emmanuel. And so it's good to see the class of 71. And I remember some of you were in my English class, and that was only for a short time. And you have really, not only through the Dorothy Day lecture, but we've seen you in many other parts of the Commonwealth and of this area as you have assisted with other anniversaries and other celebrations for the college. And we're looking forward to welcoming you back for, finally, your reunion, which has been postponed also for 2 years, when we have the class of 70, 71, and 72 reunioning at the beginning of June, the end of May. So we look forward to that, and again, my deep gratitude to the committee that's kept on going, that's been creative, and has always reached out to whatever current and important issues in our lives. So thank you so much, and thank you for this present that I will pick up and take with me. Thank you so much.
We are here today because we value our democracy and our inherent right to vote. You may have noticed coming into the library building today that you were greeted by some students. You were probably handed a program by one or two. These people, they are members of a student campus group known as Emmanuel Votes. They have been very active in encouraging voter registration with fellow students, and it's an important part of where, of what we're speaking today and where we're going forward. Executive Board President Isabella Drago will explain how the organization was formed and their efforts to encourage registration. She will then introduce our guest speaker, all right? Here are our new voters, new generation of voters. Isabella.
Hello everyone, my name is Isabella Drago, and I serve as the president of Emmanuel Votes, which is a nonpartisan organization on campus that strives to increase voter registration and participation amongst all students, faculty, and staff. So a little bit about how it started. Emmanuel Votes started in 2020. That's when we were all online, but we still, but we still managed to provide students with multiple resources by holding various trainings and educational events during the 2020 presidential election. For example, we held discussions about the roles of elected officials, youth voter engagement, and voter suppression, which is very important, and I'll talk about in a little bit. We are also a member of Boston Votes, and it's a relatively new organization, so if you don't know what it is, it's a coalition of universities in the greater Boston area working on building youth voter engagement, registration, and turnout. So as you've heard before, voter registration drives are one way we increase voter participation on campus. And just a little announcement, this upcoming Thursday, Emmanuel Votes will have a voter registration table at the Earth Month Block Party event, which is run by our fantastic Urban Food Project, might I add, which I'm also on, and some other members in here are on too. Remember that if you are a college student, you can choose to vote in either your home state or the state in which you attend school, so I just want to make sure that's clear in case there are people thinking about registering. So I would also like to remind everyone that according to Section 1 of the 26th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, quote, "The right of citizens to the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age." Ironically, federal and state political systems place barriers on citizens' rights to vote. So when we are having a discussion about voting, we must keep in mind that although the Constitution defines voting as a right, it has unfortunately become a privilege via a miasma of federal and state level structures that have made the voting system antagonistic towards Black voters and other people of color, the elderly, the economically disadvantaged, trans and non-binary voters, ex-felons, people with disabilities, and students. So if you are privileged enough to have the ability to vote and are thinking about staying home in the upcoming midterm elections or any elections for that matter, I strongly encourage you to think about how lucky you are to have that choice. One way, luckily, that we can expand the voter franchise is the National Popular Vote, which is the topic of discussion for this year's Dorothy Day lecture. I would like to introduce today's speaker, Pam Wilmot, the director of the National Popular Vote Initiative and vice president of state operations for Common Cause, a national nonpartisan advocacy organization that works to empower people to effect pro-democracy reforms. Ms. Wilmot speaks from her extensive experience as past executive director of Massachusetts Common Cause and advocate for numerous statewide grassroots citizen advocacy groups. She has been lauded for effectiveness and perspective, which is that of social worker and lawyer, pragmatist and optimist, which we all need optimism. Welcome to Emmanuel's campus. We are so excited for you to be here and to hear your insights. Now I turn it over to Ms. Wilmot.
Thank you so much, Isabel. It is so great to be here today with you all. Thank you to the organizing committee and to everyone who invited me here today. It's so great, too, to hear a new campus organization starting to engage, empower, and register voters. It is just such a critical part. And I'll get into a little bit more about some of the other issues that you touched on. As Isabel said, I am now Vice President of State Operations at Common Cause. I started right before the pandemic, so it has been all remote, which is an unusual thing for us all. And then was here in Massachusetts for over 20 years. So how many folks here have heard of Common Cause? Oh, wow, holy moly, I am impressed. That is great. For those of you that have not, or we got to big overview or just going a little deeper, Common Cause was actually founded in 1970 by John Gardner, who was a liberal Republican in the Democratic Johnson administration. He was also a college professor, the president of the Carnegie Companies, an intellectual writer who wrote a lot about what leadership meant and how government needs to renew itself. Gardner saw that government was in deep need of renewal and accountability at that time, that it had become unresponsive, untrustworthy, closed, and too corrupt. Does that sound familiar? But, you know, actually, things were much worse in many ways back then, and we forget sometimes. So, I'll talk about a little bit that in just a second, but with Gardner and others' leadership, there were many, many reforms that were passed to open up the halls of power to the people. Some of those include things like the Election Campaign Act, which established public financing of elections, contribution limits for candidates' campaign contributions. It had disclosure for some of the first times. Spending limits, which was actually struck down by our U.S. Supreme Court. The Government in the Sunshine Act, which is the Freedom of Information Act, which is the right to request a public document. We forget that that actually right didn't really exist at one point. And the Ethics in Government Act, and many, many others. So, and these were often passed in concert as a bipartisan manner. And most states, Common Cause state chapters, took those mantles, and this was the beginning of the citizens movement. So it was a wide open time, and did the same thing at the state level. Here in Massachusetts, where, as you know, I served for over 20 years, many of the rights that we take for granted today were a result of Common Cause's either legislative or ballot initiative campaigns, such as the right to attend an open meeting here in Massachusetts, the right to obtain a public document, to see what money is being raised or spent in political campaigns or in lobbying. Common Cause was directly, and the people that work with us, obviously, you know, members, citizens, interested people, and legislators who served as advocates and champions were responsible for those. And the victories continue to rack up today. Some are defensive, stopping bad things from happening. That is part of the process. And it always has been and always will be, and in some places, that's the full game. In some of the places, like Massachusetts, we have the opportunity to advance the ball as well. It is actually amazing what we can do when we work together. And it is in the very nature of government and political power, and actually power in general, to centralize and to secretize and to exclude people. And that's why we always need organizations like Common Cause and committed citizens and individuals like you. To paraphrase Ben Franklin, we have a republic, but only if we can keep it. So before I get to the core of my lecture, and it'll actually have a little bit of two parts. One is starting off about the moment that we're in now, and the second is talking about a very important reform that is closer than you think to passing, national popular vote. Let me just tell you a little bit about how I came to Common Cause and to the democracy reform movement, and why I think this is so important, although obviously I'm preaching to the converted here, it seems. The story starts when I was 23, so not too much older than you all. I was a recent graduate of Brown University, and I was working as the legislative director for the Rhode Island Public Interest Research Group, doing a wide range of consumer and environmental issues and advocacy. I had gotten into social action and become engaged in social change earlier, and how I did that is a different story. But this is really about how I came to democracy reform. So leading the Bottle Bail campaign in Rhode Island, I worked really hard. I spent 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, building a strong coalition, going door to door, recruiting volunteers, talking to the media, building opinion leader support, and it was a very popular issue. There was lots of support amongst the public, the press, and opinion leaders. But the beverage industry in Rhode Island was very powerful. I heard from friendly legislators that they were passing out large campaign contributions, they were holding lavish dinners, they were probably even making bribes, I would guess. I know that because they tried to bribe me not just once, but 3 different times. First, they offered me an undisclosed sum of cash to quit my job. Of course I didn't. Several weeks later, they contacted me and said they would pay for an all-expense trip for me and my family, however I defined it, to go anywhere in the world for 2 months, as long as I took it right then. Of course I didn't do that. Finally, a couple of weeks later, the head of the Liquor Dealers Association said, we know you're not going to quit, we know you're not going anywhere, but what about if you just endorse our alternative proposal and say it's good enough? You don't have to stop your campaign, but just say this one's, okay too. Of course I didn't do that. But I couldn't help but think, if they're offering me these kinds of things, what are they offering the elected officials? So, not surprisingly, when the vote came, we lost, and we lost in a big way. And I learned a hard lesson that year. I learned that even though there was public support on our side, even though we ran a terrific campaign, there was really no way to win this one. Only with a democratic process and institutions that function better and more ethically could it be possible in Rhode Island at that time to pass a bottle bill or other issues with vested special interests on the other side. So I decided to focus on that, to focus on democracy and the rules of government, the rules of engagement, to make them more free, fair, equitable, open, and participatory. And that commitment led me to Common Cause several years later, right after attending Northeastern Law School, where I went specifically to obtain more of the skills for this fight. So at Common Cause, I have the privilege of working for a cause I deeply believe in. I've talked about that, open, accountable, ethical government that works for all Americans and not just the rich and powerful and well-connected. And I also have the benefit of one-stop working. And so does anyone who works on democracy reform, whether in a professional capacity or in a volunteer capacity. Because every other issue depends on government making decisions based on their merits and not on factors of wealth, power, money, race, class, and the other things that so often come into the fore. And that's what Common Cause does. We fight to strengthen democracy for all people, and by advocating for an open, ethical, inclusive government, free and fair elections, and for public participation for all, especially those from underserved communities and those that have been excluded for far too long. So we are at a very scary moment in our history. We are more divided than we've ever been. There is more backlash against many of the advancements we've made, and we really are in an amazing moment. We have a crossroads, obviously, with a very successful democracy movement to expand the rights of everyone and to include more voters, more people, and an countervailing one to erode our democratic institutions and shrink access to voting by implementing new barriers to political participation. So let me show you just a few slides. As I said at first, I'm going to talk about the political moment for just a few. Probably stuff you already know, but let's just set the stage. And then I'm going to transition into the reform I think more than any other single reform could make a critical difference. In November 2020, despite all the barriers in place and a deadly pandemic, a record number of Americans exercised their freedom to vote. By some counts, including this one, it was a record turnout in more than a century. Other numbers have it slightly lower, but very close to it. And this is largely thanks to temporary voting laws passed by state legislatures, governors, and election officials from both parties, along with a historically important presidential race with a deeply unpopular president, which motivated voters along with the laws that allowed them to actually vote. The expansion of vote by mail in most states was particularly impactful for allowing people to vote safely and effectively, but even in the places where vote by mail, there was less, voters still turned out in droves to make their voices heard. Interestingly, vote by mail and absentee voting, which is a subset of that, was not a partisan reform. It was actually championed by many Republicans across the country. And in fact, until very recently, people who voted by mail tended to be older and whiter and more conservative. Now, of course, vote by mail is described as problematic, undemocratic, and subject to fraud by the very people who advocated for its passage, despite the evidence quite the contrary. So after Joe Biden won the election, the backlash was swift and vicious, incited by President Trump's big lie. A racist mob ransacked the Capitol to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. Probably the first time we've had that in our history. Afterwards, 147 members of Congress shamefully voted to reject the certification of the election results. Republican legislators then took up the baton quickly in 2021 to introduce new laws to make it harder to vote, especially for Black and brown Americans. 18 states enacted 30 new laws to restrict our voting access, with more than 400 bills introduced throughout the country. These laws include reducing vote by mail, making it easier to kick people off the voter lists, cutting the number of mail drop boxes, new barriers for voters with disabilities, cuts to early voting, even bans to give water to voters who wait in hours-long lines, and that was Georgia, of course. I think one of the things we don't notice in Massachusetts is that elections actually work relatively smoothly. They're not perfect, because nothing does, but if you're waiting in an 8-hour line in order to vote, you get pretty hungry and tired and thirsty, and providing some refreshment is actually required to have somebody stay there unless they really are packing a very large picnic box. Perhaps even more scarily, though, were laws to circumvent professional election administration. 14 states have enacted legislative shifts to shift some aspects of the authority to partisan decision makers or criminalizing election administration errors. Combined with phony sham audits like the one in Arizona, which actually didn't result in any changes, thank God, a nationwide epidemic of resignations by election officials is going to make this even worse, because they have been subject of death threats, verbal harassments, and many of these new laws making their job very much harder. Not to mention, of course, the continued drumbeat of the big lie of a stolen election. It's no wonder that, according to a CNN, here's a list of some of the new restrictive laws that were passed, and all the different iterations of them. So it's no wonder that Americans feel this, because it is actually the truth. Nearly 93% feel that democracy is at least being tested, and only 6% say there is no danger. Although there is no evidence of voter fraud in the 2020 election, or at least widespread, we do have a few people that have been convicted and basically gotten only slap on the wrists for voting multiple times for Donald Trump. And on the contrary, if there's any other, if we've had people imprisoned for very small inadvertent other violations. But anyway, among Republicans, a shocking 78% feel that Joe Biden did not win the presidency. One piece of good news in all this unrest and conflict has been increasing attention to the Constitution, and for the first time in 15 years, a majority of American people could name all three branches of government. People also had more awareness of the rights afforded to them by the Constitution, and this was true across the partisan divide. Another piece of good news is that America is waking up to the realities of racism, and that is true across the board, although there is still very deep party divide and how serious this is. So, and there is also, amongst all this bad news, also some good news. Congress, of course, has the power to override new restrictive voting laws and set fair standards for all Americans in federal voting elections. And while the Freedom of Vote Act could not obtain the needed support in the U.S. Senate, it is and does still have the strong support of the American public, including Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliated Americans. And there actually is some legislation that will be moving. Both increased funding for election administration, which will make a real difference, especially in some of those states that have cut that funding, as well as some changes that are going to be made on a bipartisan matter on the Electoral Count Act, and possibly some other smaller changes rather than the big comprehensive Freedom to Vote Act, but stay tuned on those. Additionally, states have acted to expand the right to vote. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, at least 25 states have enacted 54 laws with provisions to expand voting access. They increase early vote by mail, make registration easier, restore voting rights to Americans with past convictions, and many other things. More than 900 bills with expansive provisions have been introduced in all 50 states. Here in our home state of Massachusetts, here are some of the expansive laws. The Votes Act, which is a comprehensive bill to expand voting here in the Commonwealth, was approved by both the House and Senate and is now in a conference committee to iron out the difference between the two branches and should be signed into law in the next few weeks. Common Cause leads a broad coalition advocating for that bill, and it would expand access to the ballot box and code many of the reforms we wrote and successfully advocated for in 2020, including mailing every voter an absentee ballot application, expanding early voting, and others. It also would further expand some of the rights to make them more inclusive. And let's just take some of the look at those. So, jail-based voting reforms, ensuring that people who are held pretrial or for misdemeanors have effective access to the ballot. Joining something called the Electronic Registration Information Center, which sounds very wonky, but it is a consortium of states that pool their information in order to require their member states to reach out to people who are not registered to vote, to get them to register to vote, and also to remove people who don't deserve to be there. Because if you do that in a responsive way, it is good for democracy. It is not cross-check, it is not irresponsible, it is actually good for elections. Mail-in and early voting, a record 37 million people, 3.7 million, not 37, we don't have that many, cast ballots in the 2020 elections, with half of them being vote by mail. Massachusetts previously had only 3% of our ballots cast by mail. So going from 3 to 50 is a huge bump in one election. So we're basically going to be doing that, and I think at some point we'll get to even better vote by mail, and expanding early voting too. We actually, Massachusetts did our first early voting in 2015, very late in the process. North Carolina had early voting long before we did, as did Wisconsin and others. So the one sticking point in all this is something called same-day voter registration. It was passed by the Senate and was not passed by the House, and that's really what all the battle is about. There's other provisions, smaller provisions about election administration, but we don't need to get into those. Same-day voter registration is used in 21 states in the District of Columbia. Maine, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and New Hampshire have used same-day for decades. What it mostly allows is for people with problems in their registrations to be able to fix them on election day. Because there are problems. You go to the registry, they screw up your name, they screw up your address, or just happen to lose the paperwork, or you've moved and you forgot to update your registration. You can do that on election day. Our research shows that about 90, depending on the state, 95 to 99% of the people using election day registration are those fixing problems. And they are people already who are registered to vote. And then 5% or so are actually registering for the first time or have moved into the state. And those are people who are eligible to vote and should have the right to vote. So if you're moved, this is something that you might be able to have impact on because it is being decided as we speak. And again, the holdout is the Massachusetts House. We would think that Massachusetts would be at the vanguard of democracy reform, and we're pretty good, let's just say that, but we've had to catch up a lot in the past decade, really. Our voting laws were not the most progressive or expansive. We've had a lot of work to do, and luckily it has been happening. There is no one silver bullet to the problems of our democracy. I think in my story you heard a little bit about why ethics reform and campaign finance reform is really important. The open government that allows us to see what is happening and hold our elected officials accountable. I'm not going to talk about gerrymandering at all. Gerrymandering, we know, is a huge, that's how our elected officials determine who gets to vote for them. So who actually has a seat at the table. And it is very easy and has been perfected over centuries of how to exclude people. Of course, we all know that Gerrymander was created right here in Massachusetts, and Governor Elbridge Gerry, it's actually pronounced Gary, produced a district that looked like a salamander and went all the way from just, essentially north of Boston, all the way up to the border and sort of hooked around and had a little tail. But there is one issue that I think more than the others, and I again, all of them are important, that I think would have more impact on how people vote than any other, and that is national popular vote. It's the most important election in our country, and it is it is not one that is conducted by the rules that every other election is engaged in. So we've already passed national popular vote here in Massachusetts, and are building for momentum on it across the country for this critical reform, and I'll get into that in just a minute. But let's go to, I'm sorry, where am I? I'm not clicking back, here we go. The national popular vote is based on a very simple principle. The American people should pick the person who serves them as President of the United States, and that the candidate with the most votes should win. National popular vote would guarantee the presidency to the candidate who receives the most popular votes in all 50 states, and it would guarantee and ensure that every vote will be equal in every state and every election, and every presidential election. So let's just look a little bit about sort of the background. The Constitution gives each state a number of electors equal to its congressmen and senators. We call this Electoral College, but there is no Electoral College mentioned in the Constitution. This is the exact words. And also contrary to popular belief, the Constitution does not instruct states on how to select their presidential electors. Rather, this is a method that is reserved exclusively to the states. They get to decide. How electors are selected has changed many times, and various methods have been used over the history of our nation. Electors have been elected directly without relation to presidential candidates, selected by state legislators, elected by special elector district, elected by congressional district, and there's two states that do that. Who knows what they are? Maine. One more. Nebraska. Yeah, Maine and Nebraska. And in the rest of the country, so 48 states, they're elected in winner-take-all slates. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that the state's power to select how they choose electors is supreme, plenary, exclusively, and that it's up to them, essentially. There is no right to vote specifically for president. So initially the framers thought that this would be a deliberative body of learned individuals who would get together and debate about who was going to be the best person for the job. Once political parties emerged, which they actually didn't really think about, that's when the winner-take-all method started to come about. But so in the beginning, it was mostly legislators that appointed electors. And even at one point here in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and this was in the 1800s, I didn't write down the date, the legislature determined that the election was likely to go a way that they didn't like, so they, even though they'd had elections for a couple of cycles, they reverted to their own selection process. In fact, that could happen today. There is no right to vote for president. Our state legislature could say, sorry guys, we're picking. They would have to do it in a timely manner. They could not do this after the election. So they're up often at the same time. People would probably vote them out of office because we think we have the right to vote. So other than this, there are many problems with the current system, and that is a big one, obviously. And just to give you a little, Massachusetts actually changed the way we've selected electors 11 different times over the years. So there are many problems with the current system. Candidates have no reason to poll, advertise, organize, or visit states they cannot possibly win or cannot possibly lose. And because of these winner-take-all laws, few states are competitive. We all know the list: Ohio, Florida, Pennsylvania, and 6 or so others that change as demographics shift. Voters in those states, not as the American people as a whole, pick the president. The rest of us are spectators. Because of winner-take-all laws, candidates have no reason to pay attention to voters, except in those states where that are within a few percentage points. Indeed, most states have not seen a single campaign visit, and this is in the general elections, not in the primary, the general election, for over 20 years, much less be considered a swing state. So, consider the 2020 general election. 12 states received 96% of the campaign events by major party presidential and vice presidential candidates. 33 states and DC did not receive a single one. 3/8 of the events were just in 2 states, Pennsylvania and Florida. The situation was similar in 2016, when 94% were in a dozen states. In 2012, it was even worse. And if you looked at 8 for 2000, it was actually worse than this one too. So what's at stake here is not just seeing the candidates in person. It's about the ability to pick the president, as well as the money, the influence, the political engagement, and the public policy preferences that come with being a battleground state. In one study out of BU, disaster declarations were twice as likely to be in battleground states to be declared for similar circumstances and received twice as much money as similar ones in safe states. Carl Rowe's book talks about taking the side of a battleground state over a neighboring safe state in a water rights dispute because, again, getting voters. When the election turns on 537 votes in Florida or 6,000 votes, you can imagine there's a lot of room for manipulation. The current system also depresses political engagement, especially for people of color, because the current battleground states are whiter than average, although that is shifting now, that Georgia and something Texas may even enter that category. Voter participation is about 7 points higher in battleground states because they are courted and even hounded to go to the polls, as well as to register to vote in the first place. So we all do voter registration, but it's, a big part of the culture in a battleground state, and there's many external people coming in to make sure that it happens. We in Massachusetts sort of know about all of this kind of stuff, not necessarily turnout, but where the battleground states are, because if we're going to be engaged in the general election, do we contact our neighbors? Do we go door to door in our neighborhood? Do we write them postcards to go to vote? No, we go to Georgia, maybe before the pandemic we would have gone to New Hampshire or Pennsylvania to do it in person, but we're on the phone, we're text banking, activists are calling into these states. They're not talking to their neighbors. Under the current system also, every vote over 50% plus 1 is essentially wasted. Not just for the party that is going to lose, where this is sort of a little funny slide about that, but also even the winning side. The winning side, because it doesn't add to the total. For the losing side, the votes got them essentially nowhere. So this is a little slide about Colorado, where there was a ballot initiative in 2020, which we won to pass, well, actually it was to retain national popular vote. So the current system also means the candidates who place second in the national popular vote can also win. So that happened in 2016, 2000, 2018, 1888, 1876, and 1824. That's 5 over 56 presidents who came into office without getting the most popular votes. 2016 election illustrates how this happened. Trump won the presidency because he carried Michigan by 11,000 votes, Wisconsin by 23,000, and Pennsylvania by 44,000. Those 3 states gave him a majority in the Electoral College, 3 battleground states, even though Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 3 million votes. Each of the votes was 36 times more important. In 2000, the numbers were, of course, even more off because the 537 votes that George Bush won out of Florida gave him 10% of the electoral votes that he needed to win. And yet, Al Gore was ahead by more than 500,000 votes, about 1,000 times more or less weight than those 537 votes. Near misses are also common. In the past 6 presidential elections, the current system has produced 2 second-place presidents and 2 near misses. In 2020, a switch of 5,000 votes in Arizona, 7,000 in Georgia, and 10,000 in Wisconsin would have defeated Joe Biden, despite Biden's nationwide lead of 5.3 million votes. And in 2004, a switch of only 59,000 votes in Ohio would have given us President John Kerry, despite George Bush's nationwide lead of 3 million votes. So it could have gone the other way in 2004. So how would a national popular vote plan work? Under the Constitution, states have the power to award their electors to the winner of the national popular vote, even though this would be disadvantageous to the state that did it unilaterally. Hence, the national popular vote plan is an interstate compact, which is the type of law authorized by the U.S. Constitution to enter into legally enforceable contracts between each other. Each state, there's about 1,000 of them working right now, and each state is members of dozens of them. The U.S. Supreme Court has authorized even electoral compacts in dicta and has enforced compacts on many other subjects in courts. Under the National Popular Vote Plan, the compact would take effect when identical enabling legislation is enacted by states possessing a majority of the Electoral College, or 270 of the 538 electoral votes. Once in effect, states officials and the compacting states would simply tally the votes nationwide and give their elector slates, which are chosen by the parties, to the winner of the national popular vote in all 50 states, and not the winners of their own states or the compacting states, but all 50 states. Thus, in practice, the presidential candidate receiving the most popular votes nationwide would actually probably receive closer to 3/4 of the Electoral College. Not a small victory, but a very large one, because they would get the block from the compacting states, and then they would probably get a few others from the non-compacting states. The effect of the National Compact is mostly the same as a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College, but has the benefit of retaining the power to control presidential elections in the state's hands, so now not changing the balance of power between the federal government and the states. This is not something that most Democrats care very much about, but But we do have a lot of passionate Republican supporters. The bill has passed the Republican-controlled New York Senate. It has passed the Arizona House and the Oklahoma Senate and a bunch of committees and other places. But for our Republican supporters, this is a very, very important feature of the compact. The benefits of the national popular vote are very clear. It would ensure the candidate with the most votes wins, ensure that every state and every vote is equal in every election, increase civic participation, eliminate those misleading red and blue states. We're not red and blue states, we're purple states. 60-40 is the number in most states. And we're closer to, and with a single group of voters, there is less opportunity for a close outcome or a recount, and less incentive for fraud. With 21 small groups of voters under the current system, there's more of an impact for a recount. And the national popular vote has never been within the recount margin of error. So we're closer to implementing national popular vote than you think. 15 states and the District of Columbia, which has 3 electors, have already enacted NPV enabling legislation, providing exactly 195 electoral votes of the needed 270. And that means we need just 75 more to go until this is the way we elect a president. We actually have one more electoral vote. If you've seen these maps before reapportionment, you might like, wait a minute, how did you lose one? And we lost one because New York lost a congressional district in the last reapportionment cycle. National popular vote is actually quite popular and always has been, but we've actually lost a bit of ground since the 2020 election. Before then, and actually in 2011, when I went to 18 different states to lobby for national popular vote and talk to people on the ground, we were making great inroads. We had a lot of support from local Republican leaders, because they knew that their states were ignored in this process and that it wasn't fair. Unfortunately, the National Republican Party decided to dig in and quash their attempts to join the compact. And then the 2020 election, again, just made our polling numbers not as good as they have been. They have rebounded. I haven't seen anything since January of 2020, so I don't know where we are at the moment. But hopefully that will change. I think the continued partisanship makes it harder than it was through the beginning of our campaign effort. We could talk about a few myths, or we could keep going. Maybe I'll do one of these and then we can get to questions and answers. I don't know if people have. So let me do just one, which is about small states. I think that's something that we all, heard in our civics lessons, that that we selected the Electoral College in order to help small states. In fact, the way we elect a president was all bound up in the 3/5 compromise, where enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person for determining the number of congressional districts and therefore the number of electoral votes. It was a compromise exacted by southern slaveholding states, some of which were actually large and some were small. It was not about, there were plenty of small states in the north as well. And as I talked about, the winner-take-all method was never debated. It was much less something that was envisioned. It was in the election of 1800, no state used winner-take-all. 1789, actually, they did, but it was an emergence because of political parties. So does the Electoral College small states? No, it doesn't. Presidential candidates ignore small states, not because they're small, but because they're predictably one-party states. So Wisconsin's 10 electoral votes in the last election, for example, attracted 40 times more attention than the 24 electoral votes in the 8 smallest states. They only got 1 position. So contrary to myth, the small states are not Republican states. Actually, they're equally balanced between Republican and Democrats. If you count New Hampshire in the blue column, which it actually has been in most instances. Sometimes we put it in the swing state and have them exactly equal. But small states have only split in favor of 6 to 7 in favor of the Republican Party only once since 1992, and usually are quite the opposite. So just like large states that are ignored, candidates ignore small states because they are one-party states in presidential elections. And these small states are actually aware of their illusory electoral bonus, which actually doesn't have an impact on how they, because they do, you get the number of congressional districts plus your senators, so you get a little numeric bounce. But they're aware that this doesn't impact them. In fact, a group of states led by Delaware sued New York, which was then a battleground state, in 1966, arguing that New York's winner-take-all method for choosing their electors disenfranchised voters in their states. And the court ruled that, and they agreed, the court, that your states are negatively impacted by New York's winner-take-all, it is not a matter that can be decided on because New York is entitled to select what other method of electors that it preferred. National Popular Vote Compact has passed in 4 small states: Delaware, Hawaii, Rhode Island, and Vermont. And as I said earlier, until there was a bit more partisanship in this effort, there was a lot of very strong support in small Republican states as well. I'll just do this one because this is also definitely going to come up, and then maybe transition. So another myth is that under a national popular vote, big cities would control the election. In fact, the population of U.S. cities is equal to U.S. rural America, and equally and oppositely divided by party. Suburban areas are where elections are won and lost in modern elections, and they intend to be inhabited by swing voters, and that's why they're lost. And that's where the balance of, this is 19%, so together, this is equal at 19%, so together it's 40%, 60% of the population lives in the suburbs. So how would a national popular vote election be run? I think you have to look at both how do governors campaign and within their states, like a big state like California, or how do presidential candidates campaign when they're going to a big state to like Ohio or Florida. If you look at those things, you see that visits are distributed across the kinds of rural, suburban, urban, because when you need to get every vote and every vote counts, you need to appeal to and turn out every voter everywhere. In terms of reaching voters through advertising, often smaller media markets are more cost effective in terms of reaching numbers of voters than some of the biggest, most expensive media markets like New York. So, I could go through a few more things, but I think I have talked a lot today and covered a lot of ground. Wait, I've got another paragraph. And I'm anxious to get to your questions. It's my favorite part of these opportunities. It's just so important as we do this work and as we think about both this reform, other reforms, and democracy as a whole, that we remember and cherish the vision and values that propel our Constitution and democracy, and as Isabel mentioned, have hope for the future. It is just too easy to get discouraged when you look at this stuff. Without hope, we become cynical and corrupt and actually behave worse towards each other and turn away from the work of democracy and of collective action, which of course is never easy. This is an ongoing struggle. It will always be here. It is in the very nature of our institutions to hoard power, and the rest of us must uphold our side of the bargain, to push the doors open, to hold our leaders accountable, to fight for equality and equity and inclusion for all. Democracy is resilient, but all of us working together must do what it takes to make that real and make that promise actually happen. To repeat the oft-quoted phrase from Margaret Mead, and this is something I have seen over and over and over again, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
Thank you, Pam, for a lot of information and a lot of questions that I know that are going to come up at this point. We are going to move on to our question and answer period. Our moderator is our own Dr. Adam Silver, and we have and assisting is our Emmanuel Votes, Samantha Schumacher. I think Isabella and Tamisha will have microphones available too, so that we can take answers, questions from the audience. We all set? Begin? Is you ready to go? Okay.
Great, thank you. So thank you everybody, and thank you Pam for such a great talk. And obviously we have a lot of questions, and it's very thought-provoking. And it's also, you know, I was thinking about your comments at the end, and I think the work you're doing is so important in regards to the fact that the majority of politicians, the majority of folks in power, right, try to skirt accountability so much. And they create the system in order to do that. And the work that you do, Common Cause and other organizations really try to push back on that. And it's so important for us not to get discouraged, as you're saying. And so I just want to thank you for that. And I had questions, but we had some questions.
Let me just say one thing, and I don't know if this is up too loud. We're getting some feedback here, but
Might want to just go take it out of the Silvers.
I think one thing that I think most people don't know who don't interact with elected officials is that most of them are actually amazing people that get into the game for the right reasons. Sometimes you lose your way when you're surrounded by an echo chamber, and that can be true for everyone else. It's a very hard undertaking, and it's very difficult. So, but I am always impressed with the folks that I interact with, and we couldn't do the work that we do without our champions from the inside as well as from the outside. It's a collective action.
No, agreed. Thank you. And we think about that with the rational acting, right? And and how do you incentivize
Right.
properly in that regard? And we think about, they all want to advance what they perceive to be good public policy. We may disagree with someone what they perceive to be good public policy, but it's how we advance it. So we had a couple of questions ahead of time, and I'd like to turn over to Sam to Those?
Yeah, so when you guys registered, you had the opportunity to ask some questions in advance, and we have them printed out here. One thing that somebody mentioned was with Maine and Alaska passing electoral reforms with ranked choice voting, I wonder if nationwide change will be spurred by state actions like women's suffrage, marriage equality, and maybe recreational marijuana. Do you see that happening with the Electoral College?
So actually, this is state action. This is state action changing the way the Electoral College works, the National Popular Vote Compact. And in fact, that's how all our democracy constitutional amendments have passed in the past. And there was part of my talk that I skipped about that, so for example, women's suffrage, or the direct election of US senators. So both of which you had women and actually black voters as well being recognized in their states and being able to vote before they were able to vote on the national side. So state action preceded the federal side. The direct election of US senators was even more, turn away, that actually helps. Hi guys. Is even more relevant. So under the Constitution initially, the legislatures directly appointed US senators. There was no election. And the states led by something called the state of Oregon, the Oregon Plan, thought that we actually should have elections. So they went around and convinced other states to hold advisory elections for US Senate, which then the legislature ratified. And then when a majority of the US Senate was actually elected, it wasn't so threatening anymore. It was something that was normal and natural. So national popular vote, you can't quite do it as piecemeal, but you can in the sense of asking the legislatures to pass this compact. And 15 states and the District of Columbia, we're making good progress. We still have a long way to go. 75 electoral votes.
Might I just ask a follow-up question about that, actually, because I was thinking about...
We got you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. So one of the questions I had following up about how the state... Okay, so... one of the questions I had following up about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact regarding the number of votes. And because I think you raised the point about New York losing electoral vote. So in regards to redistricting, and I wonder how the numbers in the math, I was wondering how the numbers in the math work out. Let's say we have the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and then we redistrict based on, based on the census, 10, 20 years down the line. What happens if it goes below that threshold?
Then it goes out of effect. And if a state withdraws, it goes out of effect. So it leaves it in the power of hands. States can withdraw from the compact at any time except for 6 months before the election, so July through Inauguration Day. So a lot of people ask, well, isn't that going to be a big problem? And one, we don't know who the nominee is. They haven't really set up their campaign. So the presidential election for the general doesn't start until after that. But there are a number of reasons why that won't be an issue. One, courts have actually enforced withdrawal provisions in compacts before. Would it be a fun litigation? No, not particularly. But they have done it many, many, many different times. The other thing is that there are very few legislatures in actually meeting after July. There's only a handful. And most of them are Democratic states, California, New York, Michigan is meeting, but very few. To come back into session usually requires a quorum. We saw, even a small minority of Democratic legislators in Texas thwarting a quorum. And they didn't succeed forever, but at least in the calendar of, God, when was that? That was 2002. 2002, no, it was in 2012, I'm sorry. They fled the state, they did it again this time around, but that time it like delayed it for 2 or 3 months. In which case, the constitutional, the Electoral College would have already met. There's also, divided government in a lot of places, various other ways. Plus, the Constitution is clear, you cannot change the rules after the election. There's lots of different things. I think we do have some exposure under the Electoral Count Act that is being addressed in Congress now, because there is something, it's a failed election that is not defined, and that's a huge problem. So that's one of the loopholes in that law that our congressmen were exploiting in order to vote against the certification.
And then another question that we had, which I know that you went over in your talk, but I wasn't sure if you wanted to like dive deeper into it, was you went over how many states approved the national popular vote. And the second part of this question is, do you think, sorry, could you guys hear me? Yeah, okay, good. Sorry about that. The second part of the question is, do you think it can realistically get past the threshold to be effective? And then I guess an extension to that would be, how do you see it getting past the threshold to be effective?
So, I probably can go back and actually maybe do this. Let's see if I can walk. So we have 75 electoral votes to go. There it is. So those are the states that have passed the national popular vote compact. And we have a number of others that have passed it, as you can see in the red, who have had it enacted in one or more chambers. I think we will see it pass in Michigan next year. So that's 16 more electoral votes. I think there's a good shot in some of the other states, like, actually it isn't listed here, but Minnesota. We would consider doing a ballot initiative in Arizona. Maine has passed it basically like 3 or 4 times in different ways. Nevada passed it, but the governor vetoed it. So that's 10 more. Virginia was a possibility, but it's kind of, it will eventually pass in Virginia. Pennsylvania and North Carolina are also possibilities. So of the states that we're focusing on a number of them, but this is not going to happen by 2024. So I wish I could tell you it is, but it's not. It's just, these things take a long time. We didn't get early voting in Massachusetts until 2015. You know how long we've been working on that? Since like 1970. And early voting is hardly a revolutionary or ground. It is very helpful. It helps people vote. It's convenient. It encourages. It's good. It's a good thing, but it's not the same kind of sea change that this is. So the fact that we've gotten as far as we have in 15 years is pretty impressive.
Questions from the audience?
Yeah, this is good because I want to follow up on this. I love this map and what you're showing here. I think it's super important, but I don't quite understand it because you showed that you had, what, 75% passed or not passed? I think you showed another slide after that. Or 70.
We have 75 electoral votes to go, and we passed it in 195 electoral votes.
I guess the numbers are confusing to me, what needs to pass. So it goes by electoral votes and not by states or some such thing?
Yes. So each state has a number of electors equal to their U.S. senators, so every state gets 2, and then the number of congressional districts. So it's roughly by size. I actually have a slide on that at the very beginning. Oh, where is it? This is the number of electoral votes that each state gets.
Yeah, by population.
So it's by population, number of congressional districts, which is population, plus the 2 U.S. Senate districts.
All right.
And that's why smaller states like South Dakota and North Dakota, get 3. Even by population, they would just be entitled to 1 if it was just straight population.
Okay.
And California,
Super.
is about 1/6 of the entire country.
Yeah, it confused me a bit, but I know you understand it. I don't need to understand it all the calculation and what the numbers.
So you just add them up, the states that have passed this,
Yeah.
and it has to equal to 270, which is a majority in the Electoral College. That's what's needed to elect a president. So this is not, what I'm talking about today is not a constitutional amendment. If we pass a constitutional amendment, this would all go away. You would never see a map like this ever again.
I'd love it. I'd love it. Please do it.
What you would see though on our national popular vote isn't this so much, is you would see where is it? No. Oh well, I don't know. Can't see it anything. I don't know where it is.
Yeah.
You would see just like you do in a gubernatorial race. You would see number of votes, number of votes, number of votes, number of votes, number of votes. It would just add up, add up, add up, add up. And that map would be irrelevant. It would still be there because the Electoral College still exists, but it is defanged. It is no longer winner take all. It is all of us voting all at once for the candidate of our choice. The people who meet to cast the electoral votes, has anyone ever been an elector here? No.
No way.
Okay. You know who they are?
No, they're secret. They're hiding.
They are secret and hiding. They're selected at the party. They get dressed up in ball gowns, and the Democratic Party, the Republican Party do. It's a ceremonial rubber stamp of the winner take all by statewide, and it isn't like some Republicans and some Democrats. It's whoever wins that state. So in Massachusetts, we don't have 6 Democrats and 4 Republicans. We have all of our electors are all Democrats, and they go and they ceremonially cast their thing. In this, they would ceremonially cast it for the winner of the national popular vote. So that ceremony would still exist, but instead of a rubber stamp for the current system, it's a rubber stamp for a national popular vote.
So 195 passed.
Mm-hmm.
But you were, okay, so it's basically 3/4 have
Yes.
passed?
Correct. Yeah. And
That's
so we
incredible.
only need 1/4 more. We need 27%. So in between a quarter and
Wow, that's terrific. One big state or so.
If California hadn't passed it, we'd be pretty close. Yeah.
Of the ones that are highlighted in
Great,
pink,
thank you. That
how
helped.
many electoral votes does that equal? So are you going to get close to the 75 you need, or are you going to still be short?
That would be, if every single one of these passed, we'd be over.
Okay.
California's there. Florida, we need.
But a handful wouldn't do it. So North Carolina is a big state. Michigan is big. Michigan, Pennsylvania, a few others would be good.
Well, with regard to the compact, I see that Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Florida are not, I don't think I need it. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Florida are not part of the compact, but they're also very important swing states. I also look at Little New Hampshire, our Live Free or Die, so the north of here. The bottom line is an awful lot of money that is spent in all of those states with regard to the election. And if they join the compact, that probably is going to be diminished considerably. So they tend to be held back, I should imagine, in coming forward to join God, country, and the American way.
Yes, that is correct. It's a lot of money and a lot of influence. I mean, their issues are the ones that are talked about. The only downside is it can be, maybe not for the politicians, but for the people that live there, it can be too much attention. They get special cuts on their broadcast TV, although who watches broadcast TV anymore, I don't know, because they have more campaign ads. They have people calling them up. They have people, sending them letters. They have people knocking on their door, and some people like it, but most people are pretty sick of it and would really rather that the rest of us share in that activity, which would happen. The money would just be I used to have numbers, and I'm not sure why I didn't have included this time, of the amount of money spent. And the amount of money is a lot. And we're talking about August, mid-August through mid-November. The battleground states are $100 million each. A lot of money in that 6-week period.
Thank you.
I think we have one more time for one more question. I'm proud to say I come from a compact state of Connecticut, and most of the people here are probably nearby states, but what can... Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Most of us, I think, in the audience probably come from compact states. So what can we do? That was exactly what can we do to help the effort?
So yes, it is true that the impact, just like your impact as a voter, means more in the compacting state. The impact means more if you had in a non-state that hasn't joined. But we do have phone banks where we are calling people. You can write a letter to the editor, an opinion piece. I think the more people that hear about it, the buzz increases. You can host an informational event. We don't do so much text banking anymore, but that is also an opportunity. And of course, support Common Cause and the National Popular Vote. These things do tend to have a cycle, so if we do ballot initiatives, there might be even in-state opportunities. I think it's a little harder in legislative campaigns, but if we don't pass Michigan this time through the legislature, it probably will become a ballot initiative. Arizona might be a ballot initiative. And there's a ton more information, especially at this nationalpopularvote.com. And National Popular Vote is a separate organization from Common Cause. We work in concert, although they are the founders of this idea, and their website will kind of cross your eyeballs, but it is a treasure trove of information.
I know we're short on time. Guys, I know we're short on time. I'd just love to ask one last question, and this alludes to a point that you raised up. Thanks.
So one of the questions I'd like to ask is, you alluded to it in your talk about the Electoral Count Act, trying to reform that, and you talked about it a little bit earlier about the intimidation of professional election workers. And I think that is part, if I'm not mistaken, of the reform of the Electoral Count Act, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, because you seem pretty optimistic that legislation will be enacted. And I think, because that's something we don't talk enough about, right? We can talk about voting regulations, and obviously very important, but what is happening to the politicization of our local elections, and the way it's manifested and the way it's handled.
Well, even Jocelyn Benson just had won a lawsuit against a harasser who had threatened her family because of, the number of death threats and everything that our election officials are getting, and just like mom and pop folks who work and our neighbors and things, it's outrageous. local law enforcement can do and does have tools to do it, things about it. The Electoral Count Act primary provisions aren't about protecting election officials. Some of that was in the Freedom to Vote Act, but it's sort of been transferred onto this other vehicle that is moving. That's what happens in the legislative process. You start off with one thing and then you kind of stick stuff in that are, it is related, obviously. But the thing that I had mentioned that I am also really concerned about, though, is some of the laws that have been passed to and are being considered to substitute legislative judgment for those of election officials. So, nullification of results and really removing nonpartisan election administration, the sham audits that are being run by people that don't know what they're doing and are not adhering to professional standards and that are really about a partisan witch hunt and not about, audits are actually a good thing. We are big supporting of audits, but, only when they're done in the right way and for ideally for the right reasons. But so I think some of it is just the process working out. I think there will be some additional protections that will pass Congress. One of the problems in any kind of legislative sphere is that even if you have rational people who want to make changes and they're in the party that is being accused of wrongdoing, sometimes the reaction is, oh, I don't want to do anything because then I'll say your accusations are right. And that isn't, unique to one side or the other. I see that happening and playing out in lots of other ways. But I think we will make some progress. Will it be everything that we want? No, probably not. Certainly not. But federal law is really important in this area because we do have some places that are willing to go very far and putting their thumb on the scale.
Okay, let's continue this conversation as we move toward the reception, and Pam will be there as well. We're at the Fenway Room, which is just across the way on the second floor. Follow the crowd and or the Emmanuel Votes people who will help guide us to that room for anyone who's not familiar with the campus. Thank you all very much.